There's a book out here, a sacred book that only the pure of heart can find. And it's about old ghost stories of Appalachia. Now I'm going out in the woods today to try to find it. And if I can find it, I'm gonna read some from it just for y'all. Could have sworn this was the area I was told I could find it. The fact that they're blowing up in that quarry up the way is really taking away from my focus. Look at this old abandoned sawmill. Man, this thing is overgrown. This is wild. Beautiful. Hold up. What's that? Ghosts of the Southern Mountains and Appalachia by Nancy Roberts. Well, I'll be hot damned. I found it. I'm gonna skim through it and see what I can find, and I'll read something for you. Story in here called The Ghost Fiddlers, as in fiddle. The Ghost Fiddlers, based out of Hill Country, West Virginia. There is an old house in West Virginia that only comes alive at night. That is, if you can say that a house inhabited by spirits can come alive. The old log cabin leaned forward and seemed to stare menacingly. Its supports sagged. A door hung from one hinge. The young couple stood for a moment and stared back. Then the man looked over to look at the steps. Pretty good shape. This one's a house with good timber and we can make it right. Oh, Peter, this old house scares me just to look at it. Scares you? Yes, there's something wrong about it. There'll never be anything but sadness in it. You're not thinking straight, Sari. Your family lets the tunes from that old fiddlin' make him feel all sorts of crazy things. Now remember, I don't ever want none of that fiddlin' in our home. Sari's eyes looked hurt, but she gave a reluctant little nod. She was a pretty girl who loved to sing and dance, and she was from a family of fiddle players. The girl could play about as well as the men. But Peter Barton thought the fiddle was an instrument of the devil, for that's the way he was raised. Music led a body away from things they ought to be doing, like serving the Lord, and can make him forget he would soon be standing before the judgment seat. Peter had wanted to preach, but had worked so hard there was no time to practice it. But my, what a wonderful prayer he could make. Lots of folks went to preaching just to hear Peter Barton pray. He began to repair the house, and sometimes Sari would come out bringing some of the yellow rose bushes from her home place to plant to keep it from looking so desolate. It was a somber wedding with no music, for Sari's dad and brothers knew better than to fetch any fiddles along. A year later, a boy was born. Peter wanted to call him after one of the thundering prophets of the Old Testament, but Sarai said her grandpappy's name, James, was the same as one of the apostles, and her husband agreed. They lived to themselves, for Peter never wanted to take her over to see her family. For the instrument of the devil, the fiddle, could often be heard, and strains floating from the cabin at night. Secretly, Peter feared he might come to like one of the gay tunes or plaintive lover ballads, and then he was convinced he would lose his faith. Folks passing the Barton house at supper time could hear Peter's strong, resonant voice reciting the blessing as if he were giving a benediction to the multitude. He took Sarai and the boy to church and never missed a meeting. People said the prayers he prayed could make chills run down a man's spine. Somehow, he never had any close friends, for he didn't seem to trust anybody. Some said it was because he'd had to scrabble so hard for what he'd got. They also said he was a strong-tempered man, that both Sarai and the boy were afraid of him. Sarai's mom took sick one day and they sent for Sarai. So Peter took her and the boy James on their 2 white mules. Right off, James saw a fiddle hanging on the wall and asked his granddaddy what it was for. It was the first time he'd ever seen one. His granddaddy took it down and played a gay little lilting melody. James wanted to try it, but his father scowled and the boy was afraid to touch it. When they left, Peter told James that he was never to play such an instrument of the devil, and if he ever took it up, he'd have to leave home. Sometimes Peter would make money by running a raft of logs down the river. There was much timber in the area, and he would tie the loose logs into the raft and ride it downstream where he would sell them by hand. It took about 4 days because he would have to walk back. One day while he was gone, James's grandmother became sick again, and he and his mother went over to the house. He asked his granddad to play for him, and when he had finished, James wanted to try it. Sarai's father suggested she take the fiddle home with her and teach the boy while his father was away. Sarai looked at the fiddle with longing, and all the beautiful, haunting melodies she had learned as a girl came to mind. How she missed them! She couldn't resist, and from then on, she and James would play when his father was away. You go, girl. One morning, Peter told them goodbye and set out for the river to run a raft of logs downstream and sell the timber. The water's pretty high, Sarai, and it may take me longer to get back, for some of the small streams are going to get higher if it rains some more. I may have trouble getting across them on foot, but I'm aiming to get back in about 4 days. Sarai did her chores. James chopped some wood, planted taters in the garden, and in the late afternoon when he was finished. That night after supper, his mom saw him look up toward the loft where they had the fiddle hidden. Her eyes met his, and she nodded her head. Go ahead, Jamie. He played while his mother sat listening in the old rocking chair her pa had given her. Every now and then, she would take the fiddle herself and play a tune. The two of them had such a good time they paid no mind to the late hour. Meanwhile, Peter had set down the river, but the water was high, and about 10 miles from home he reached a spot where the river narrowed and curved. Here the current was swift, and it pulled the raft right over the big rocks he had always managed to see and avoid when the water was lower. The raft went all to pieces, and only by clinging onto one of the logs was he able to keep from drowning. He stopped at a house to dry himself, and by the time he had walked all the way home, It was getting on towards midnight. He was surprised to see the light of the lamp burning in the little cabin, but as he drew closer, he knew why. The wind brought the sound of a gay foot-tapping melody called Sweet Sunny Sal. Peter's face grew grim and hard. The appealing lilt of the tune, rather than touch his heart, only moved him to anger. The fiddle was used at dances and other frolics. It was clearly the instrument of the devil in the eyes of the mountain preachers, and Peter flung open the back door in a black rage. He snatched the fiddle out of Jamie's hands, and taking his knife, he deliberately cut every string. When he hung it near the mantel and turned to Jamie, thundering, "There hangs the instrument of the devil as a reminder to all them who would not obey. I told you, Jamie, you'd have to leave this house if you ever brought that fiddle into it. Now go to your grandpappy's and stay there." Jamie had no light, but he was afraid of his father, and he left right then. Sari thought she would go to her pa's place and stay there till Peter cooled down, and then come back. But that was not to be. The following morning, Peter rose early to milk the cow. She was in the far pasture, and when he went to fetch her, he saw a dark, crumpled figure laying at the foot of a cliff at one side of the field. It was Jamie. He had lost his footing in the dark, falling down the cliff head first, and struck a stump. The boy's neck was now broken. Peter carried his son's body back to the house. It was said that Peter was never the same. He no longer took his logs down the river. He scarcely talked to anyone now, and in church he never prayed aloud again. 4 years later, he was killed when one of his mules kicked him, splitting his head open. Some folks said he had told Sally he would live only 4 years, 1 year for each string he had cut on the fiddle. He was buried beside his son in the graveyard. Sari lived on in the house, getting queerer and queerer, and late at night when folks walked the path near the cabin, they would hear the strains of a fiddle playing. One morning, someone found her sitting in a rocking chair with a fiddle across her lap and a smile upon her face. Stranger still, even after the old lady died, the sounds kept on, and if anything, there was more and more reports of music rippling through the night air coming from the old cabin. Sometimes gay, but more often sad and plaintive. Even today, there are few people who care to walk the path near the old cabin after dark, nor does anyone want to stay overnight or live there again. It is a dark, sagging skeleton of a place, yet they say that near midnight the eerie, haunting music of Jamie's fiddle may still be heard, coming from beyond the grave. And that was a story called The Ghost Fiddler, based out of Hill Country, West Virginia. Show you this right here. From the book Ghosts of the Southern Mountains and Appalachia by Nancy Roberts.